The crown prince turned out to be a monster, and he was a disgrace to the great empire, for he was born a monster who had been abandoned by the emperor himself. In fact, in the distant Golden Age, humans and heterogeneous lived in harmony on the continent. But everything changed because humans began to oppress the heterogeneous, which turned into war, which resulted in the heterogeneous being banished to the wasteland, and those who survived hid from the humans. Some became expensive slaves that were sold for experimentation. The monsters were actually heterogeneous, but if they had enough magical powers, they could transform into humans. And the empire is extolled because they had a god bloodline, but there was a theory that all power was not taken from divine blood, but from the genetics of monsters. And then, looking over the monster, the girl reflected that it was indeed strikingly beautiful. After that, when the monster began to try to break out of the cage, the girl calmly agreed to put it to sleep, for she had originally been the person who had brought it to the dungeon. But it wasn't that simple. After all, the protagonist was trapped in a body that belonged to Floria, and she had the ability to control the scent of flowers. And so the man demanded that Floria put the beast to sleep so that it could be more easily studied. And Floria promised to make the scent penetrate to the very depths of the monster's heart. And then the man, having stroked the girl's head, stated that she was of some use and wished her good luck, and then quietly left. And the agitated Floria looked at the caged prince and realized that now was the day when he must tear her to pieces. As it turned out, the girl read the book before she fell asleep, and when she woke up, she found herself in the body of Florius, the daughter of the villain Count Varian from the book, and then realized my hopeless situation. The girl decided to get recognition and become a member of the Count's family, although she initially knew that death awaits her very soon. But at that moment, her older brother Arden approached her. He was a good-natured and gentle man like a ray of sunshine in the midst of a cold and cruel family. And because of his shrewdness, the lad immediately noticed that Floria looked very depressed, but she calmly explained that she was merely thinking, because she must have gotten overexcited working with a rare species of monster. And then Arden immediately guessed that his sister was referring to the panther his father had brought, and she awkwardly informed him that she wanted to check on his condition and asked that her brother not worry, and thought to herself that she felt insanely sorry for Arden, and she also cared about the fate of other good people, because in the original story, they would all die because of the hands of the main character. Later activating the entrance to the basement, Floria realized that she had long ago made a decision that she would change the original story for the sake of the good people around her. And she was willing to sacrifice her life for it. Finding herself near the trapped panther, Floria noticed that the animal was injured, and pouring the contents of the vial on his hand promised to ease his pain. And then the previously angry and insanely disgruntled beast gradually began to calm down. After which, Floria Poe wondered if she understood correctly that this panther's name was Cartel. But Cartel clearly wasn't happy that someone had learned of his name. And a flustered Floria explained that she was a flower girl, albeit a half-breed, but was surprised that Cartel was able to speak. But displeased Cartel also noticed this oddity, for the girl was simply incapable of reading anyone's mind, so he advised her not to lie. And then, unhappy with such an accusation, Floria explained that flower girls had the gift of vision, which they could use once in their lifetime. And this power was the first and last time she had used it on Cartel. In fact, the power was called the Blessing of the Flower and was marriage-proof, for the partner could read his lover's mind, and of course Floria lied, for she was a half-blood and did not possess such a power. But taking advantage of the situation, she decided to make a contract with Cartel, because she was well aware that the guy could actually turn into a normal form, and promised to find a way to break the seal that was keeping him from turning. And in return for her help, she asked for a chance for her and others to survive. And then, thinking about it, Cartel smilingly suggested that the girl come into the cage, as she wanted to make a deal, and if she went in, she could prove that she believed him. And in addition, using Floria's power, he could become human for a while. And although Floria was worried, but she realized that she just needed to earn the trust of the guy, so she agreed to his terms, and thought that in the original, Cartel could only lift his sorrow when he was mad, but she would have to lift the seal while he was sane. And then she found herself in the cage near the panther, and following the arrangement, she approached to give him her power so that Cartel could break his seal for a while. But eventually the strength began to leave her body too quickly, and Floria felt extremely exhausted, so she couldn't stand on her feet. But at that moment, the lad ordered her to open her eyes, and when she obeyed, she saw that he had really assumed his human form, and gently supporting her by the arms so that she would not fall, inquired if he had done as Floria wished. But all she could see in front of her was a man with a hair color reminiscent of the night sky and his predatory eyes, and Floria was curious as to what Cartel looked like, for she had only read about him in a book before. But looking at the agitated Floria, Cartel drew nearer, and whispering in her ear wondered if his human form frightened the girl more than the beastly one, and looking at her trembling body warned that he wouldn't kill her now, so she shouldn't have been so afraid. But at that moment, the guy noticed that her column pendant on her chest glistened, and Floria awkwardly pulled away and warned that her father was calling her, because of which she had to run away. And as she walked away, she realized that it had taken her longer than she expected to get in touch with the cartel, which could have made her father very angry. But after one last glance at Cartel in her panther form, she warned him that she would come back to make a deal with him and ran away under the guy's scrutiny. But eventually, once she was in the mansion and running down the steps to the Succeed, she was approached by her brother. He asked why this half-breed was in such a hurry and grudgingly stated that his father would certainly not call such a worthless daughter. This boy's name was Rakus, and he was the Countess's second and only blood child. And in the book, Floria had no hatred for the guy, though he was annoying her enough. But then Rakus couldn't stand it and wondered how the half-breed dared to ignore him. She only mockingly informed him that she was much more useful than her brother. But he swung unhappily to strike his sister, but even such a thing did not quite embarrass her, for she calmly informed him that she had no time for idle talk, and activated her ability, namely the scent of a paralyzing flower that would render a person unable to move in seconds. And then looking at the frozen, shocked Rakus, Floria calmly stated that he was too stupid to defeat her and suggested to end such a pointless conversation and walked past to her father's study. But the Count immediately noticed that Floria was late, but in her defense she said that she had run into Rakus. And so ignoring the news of so useless a child as his own native son, the Count inquired about the panther's condition, and found out that it also relieves pain. So the Count asked Floria to watch the beast, since it couldn't be moved this week. And Floria calmly reported that the Count could indeed trust her, and bowed and left. She thought about the fact that she couldn't get used to the man's gaze and felt like she was taking a test every time, and thought about the fact that he looked like he knew the truth and realized she should obviously be more careful. After which she went to the Countess and reflected that in this room she had always felt some inexplicable fear and remorse. For the Countess was an insanely kind person who cared for all half-breeds as if they were her own children. And the Countess always took care of Floria when she was young, and also once helped all the heterogeneous who were the Count's hostages escape. However, the next day the woman became feeble-minded, and everyone around her thought it was just an accident, but Floria knew it was the Count's fault. But in the end, unable to bear the gaze of so kind a woman, Floria shook herself and excused herself from the room, trying to convince herself that she had to cope with everything, for she had no other choice. Eventually, the next day came and the girl came to Cartel again, but demanded a promise from him that he would not behave as shamelessly as yesterday. But Cartel smiled as if he didn't know what he was talking about, but seeing the girl's confused face, he agreed to her terms. And then Floria went into his cage and touched him again, and gave her strength so that the lad could assume his true form. But she couldn't stare at the guy's naked body for that long, so she tossed him some clothes and demanded he put them on. But the surprised Cartel only stated that he had never dressed himself, and although at first Floria was surprised, she remembered that Cartel had indeed lived his whole life as a panther, and so decided to help Cartel, but demanded that he not move and stand still. And while I was helping him put on his clothes, I didn't know where to look to stop looking at his torso. But Cartel immediately noticed such behavior and only smilingly inquired why Floria was so embarrassed, at which point Floria realized that he had simply decided to play a joke on her, and it seemed to have become his habit. But when she looked back at the guy, she explained that next time he'd dress himself because she couldn't go through something like that again, ended by Cartel tearing off his clothes sleeves, for he felt that they restrained his movements, and the disgruntled girl wondered how hard it was to bring clothes, but decided to proceed with the treaty and stated that she was to marry Cartel. But the guy really thought the girl was crazy, but unfortunately, Floria just couldn't admit that she had no other choice. So she calmly informed him that her father wouldn't stop doing experiments on him, and in the end, he would just go crazy. And she thought that after that, he'd run off and kill her whole family, and it would be exactly 1 year later. But the guy only awkwardly wondered if Floria had some weird preference for guys. But offended by such a thing, Floria explained that they needed to become a couple in order for her to stop doing experiments. And since her father was a collector of rare heterogeneous, he would be only too happy for them to get married so they could wait quietly for a while before making their escape. And the Count will have to stop his experiments. And then thoughtfully, Cartel wondered, was it for this reason that Floria had used on him the flower blessing that is used on consorts? And Floria only wondered when the guy even had time to know about something like that, for she had said what she had the gift of seeing the truth. But she didn't know when the Cartel had time to learn that the florists were using the gift on their spouses. And at that moment, Floria became insanely ashamed, because in fact she never had this gift, because she did not receive the blessing of the goddess. But Cartel immediately noticed such excitement and demanded an explanation why Floria had acted in such a manner. But she calmly informed that it was an urgent matter, and therefore she had no other choice. And Cartel only smiled, agreeing to her answer, but was about to demand something in return. And approaching Floria's face, he demanded that she should not even think of deceiving him. And the maddeningly confused Floria conceived that she could now feel the warmth of Cartel's breath on her skin, and her whole body felt as if it were electrocuted, and his gaze was like that of a predator looking out for its prey. And Cartel's eyes were literally telling her that it wasn't him that was in the cage, but the girl herself. But she realized that she had chosen this path herself, and so she was obliged to continue to follow it until the main character of the book came along. But finally, getting a grip on herself, Floria grabbed the guy by the chain and pulled him closer, demanding that he speak to her in a nice tone of voice and behave obediently. And then the lad, appreciating such a gesture, intercepted the girl, and pressing her to him informed her that from this time on, their pact was concluded. Floria eventually returned to the mansion, where there was already an uproar about Rakis breaking a vase of flowers that was her father's favorite. And the insanely disgruntled Count stated that his son was really useless, and he wouldn't be able to recoup what Rakis had damaged, even if he sold Rakis himself his as much as 30 times. And stated that he simply could not believe that the guy was really his son, and angrily reached for the weapon that hung on the wall. And at that moment, Arden realized that their father was now quite evil, and even capable of killing their brother, and a frightened Floria didn't know what to do. But she ended up covering her brother and asking her father to calm down, which he was insanely unhappy about. But the girl only calmly explained that he shouldn't waste his energy on such insignificant things. But she mentally turned to Rakis, explaining that she wasn't saving him at all, because she didn't care what happened to him after what he'd done. So with a smile, she suggested the Count give Rakis some sort of occupation, like he could run the sewers and prove his usefulness. The sewers are where all the waste from the experiments went, and all the waste was collected in that place. Even though it was a very dirty place, it was an important task to manage it, because the experiments had to be kept secret. Floria stated with a smile that Rakis would always want to be very helpful, and so he would be only too happy to do something like that. And the lad, looking over his father's sword, informed that he could indeed be trusted with the job and would do it properly. And Floria is happy that her plan worked, telling father that she wanted to talk about something important, and wondered if she should try to play up that emotion properly, so she made her cheeks flush with a shy blush, and also adjusted her look to be shaky and very awkward. And after all this, confessed to the Count that she would very much like to marry, and she looked very plausible indeed. But looking around, she thought she had expected such a reaction, because of course no one had expected her to say something like that. But when Arden inquired who should be Florius's bridegroom, she did not hesitate to inform him that it should be the monster in the cave, namely the huge panther their father had brought. But looking at the Count's anxious face, Floria realized that she had to think of something urgently, so she calmly informed him that she was doing it out of a desire to help her father, for there was a legend of that flowers attracted the beast, and it turned out to be true, and so she was sure she could definitely tame that panther, and explained to the Earl, who still did not understand his daughter's wish, that their family owned the weakness of royalty. For the cartel was a secret of the royal family that must not be revealed, and explained that she could turn this monster into a human. After all, once upon a time, there was a legend that if a monster had enough magic power, it could regain its human form. And though Cartel was locked in a cage because he was born in animal form, he was still of royal blood. And if he can regain his human form, then the balance of power in the entire country will change. And the entire empire will be divided into divine and demonic schools. Followers of the divine schools believe in the divine origin of the royal family, and they are devotees of traditional authority. Unlike the followers of the demonic school who kept forbidden literature and knowledge of other kingdoms, and this literature held secrets, so the demonic school's main ideology was forbidden in the empire. However, without the other side, the empire could not develop, and it posed a threat. And also, Floria remembered about the magic stone that was presented as a gift from God. But finally, putting her thoughts together, all she promised the Earl that she would be sure to give him the lives of the royal family. And she remembered that the Empress who gave birth to Cartel was very weak and died. The Empress had a miscarriage, which led to her being stripped of her title and hanged, but it was just an intrigue and was done to hide the existence of the cartel. And then thinking about it, the Count admitted that he had not even expected that this panther would turn out to be a cartel, but wondered why Floria did not come to him as soon as she began to guess something like this. But looking at his face, Floria immediately realized that the man clearly did not believe her, and so stated emphatically that she simply did not want to marry a common, powerless man, and she wanted to remain useful to the Earl. But if she married, she would have to leave her father, and she wouldn't want to be the spouse of some ordinary man. So she tearfully begged the Count to let her be a part of his great cause. And then, after a moment's silence, the Count laughed and remarked that Floria was much smarter than he had expected and agreed to fulfill her request. And he thought about the fact that he needed to come up with some sort of title for this monster so that he could arrange Floria's wedding before he even became human, and decided that a royal title of an overseas country would suit him. And Floria thanked him and thought that such a title would be a wonderful fit, because it would look like an alliance between countries. The monster Cartel was not worthy of the title of her husband, but Arden could not bear to enter the conversation, and stopping his father asked if he was serious about giving Floria in marriage to an animal. And the shocked Floria understood that such behavior was clearly not like her calm and quiet Arden. But the boy continued the list, despite the fact that the Count had made it clear that everything had already been decided. And then his pendant burned his skin with great force, which immediately made him feel very sick, and he began to suffocate. And the Earl calmly reported that he had warned his children not to cross him. In fact, the Earl's ring was connected to the pendants that Floria had, as well as her 3 brothers. And these pendants were the instrument by which the Count summoned them to her office, and also disappeared their training. And the pendants were the main reasons they couldn't get out of that castle, because they were impossible to remove, and they showed their location. And then Floria remembered how the Count had once activated that pendant on her as well, and let his son watch her suffer, explaining that he was the cause of her well-being. And it was from that moment that Arden realized what a terrible place he was in. But the Count calmly passed on, explaining that he trusted Florius with the rest of the preparations, and she calmly promised not to disappoint him. Though mentally she wondered how much of a scary and horrible person he was in general. As a result, once Floria got the Count's permission, it was easier for her to come to the cave to see Cartel, and the experiments on him were stopped, so that in a few days everyone around would know the news of her marriage. And the surprised Cartel reflected that he hadn't at all expected a girl so talented to turn the situation around. But Floria cheerfully reported that she always makes the best of things when she decides to do something. Eventually, since that day, many things and necessities were added to the cave, so Floria was glad she had succeeded in fooling her father. But she was worried because the situation with her brother Arden wasn't the best. Her brother was unusually stubborn and couldn't accept his sister's decision. But she couldn't tell him her plans, which made her feel awkward. But in the end, the girl calmly looked at Cartel and asked him to obey her in front of other people, because it would be dangerous if her father or brothers suspected something. But at that moment, Cartel felt someone coming down toward them, and Floria wondered if it might be Father, though he had given no warning that he was coming. But when she saw a fellow with shining silver hair and pointed and uplifted eyes the color of a clear sky, she immediately realized that it was her brother Rikael. He was the eldest son of the family. And a worried Floria did not understand when he had come back and why he had gone into the cave immediately after his arrival. But without betraying her surprise, she ran up to him and asked him why he was back so early and how he had spent his time in the capital. And she thought about the fact that Rikael was not accurately described in the book because he was the character who did his father's bidding, and Floria had never been able to recognize him, even though they lived together. But eventually, following Rikael's gaze, Floria realized that he had come to see the monster, and Rikael wondered if she had really decided to marry the monster. But Floria calmly explained that he was not a monster, but a prince, and would soon be her husband. But looking over the panther, Rikael stated that he didn't look like a human at all, and was simply an animal of enormous size. But Cartel only wondered with a smile if this sparrow had no sense of fear at all. Frightened out of her wits afterward by such a comment, Floria remembered that no one but her could hear Cartel's voice, but didn't understand how Cartel understood. That Rikael was indeed of the bird kind and had the blood of rare silver falcons flowing through him. And so even though Floria didn't understand how Cartel knew about her brother's origins, calling him a sparrow was clearly too disrespectful. But Rakiel calmly inquired, would Floria not care even if she had to share the same bed with such a monster? But she calmly informed him that there would be no difficulty in doing so when he became human. But unable to bear such a thing, Rakiel unsheathed his sword, stating that in that case he needed to solve this problem before Cartel could turn into a human. And then trying to talk her brother out of it, Floria saw how determined his gaze was at that moment and didn't understand how he could even kill one part of his father's collection, for it meant literally defying his father himself. But it seems Cartel was not at all surprised by something like this and was determined to take the fight, informing him that he would now teach this bird to fly. And a flustered Floria realized that she definitely had to stop them, but didn't know where to start. But the next moment, she realized with a smile that she knew one way, but wasn't unsure how well it would work. And so she yelled at Cartel, then at her brother, and made the two of them stop, and both guys were so shocked that they immediately stopped. But the surprised brother asked if Floria had given such a monster a name, to which she calmly explained that she couldn't call him just a monster all the time. But Cartel didn't like the name he'd made up, because he didn't understand why the girl didn't call him by his usual name, but gave him a nickname like a pet cat. But she realizes that the situation between the guys can escalate left Cartel without explanation and asked her brother to leave first. But at that moment they were joined by a bird that always accompanied Rikael. His name was Pi, and so the girl could not resist and joyfully greeted the little friend. And even Rikael himself seemed happy to see his sister, though Floria still didn't understand how he'd heard the news of her wedding so quickly, since rumors couldn't have reached the capital so quickly. Besides, he had come to the cave and obviously knew that Rikael was here. But the next moment Floria noticed that her brother Arden was in the window, and speculation began to creep into her head. But still, when Rikael tried to ask if Floria was really going to marry that monster, she calmly warned that she wouldn't tell her father anything about Rikael trying to hurt the panther. But at that moment she turned around and looked at the guy, because it seemed to her at once that he was acting strangely as if he were holding back his emotions. But it was evening of the same day, and now Floria was in her room, and the maid was putting her head in order. Floria had ruby-red eyes, brilliant rose-colored hair that was developing, and a fair face, in beauty not protruding from the roses, and she still hadn't gotten used to how beautiful she was. When Floria was quite ready, she came down to take part in the formal dinner and apologized for being late, for she was quite used to formal family dinners. But she immediately turned her attention to Arden, and then realized that her brother was probably still in shock over her statement, for he could not accept his beloved sister's marriage to a beast. Eventually, when everyone was gathered, the Count announced that their formal dinner was due to Rikael's premature return, then asked his son how he was doing in the capital. But he calmly reported that he was observing the target's adaptation, and though they tried to avoid specific words, Floria guessed right away that maybe they're talking about the alicorn because it was created exactly as it's described in the legends. But the creature's horn and wings were created by the Earl's experiments, and so it resembled a chimera of a horse. And the Count only hoped that the alicorn wouldn't die so easily, for there were too many demonic creatures invested in him. And then Floria guessed that the Count wanted to present the creature to the world during God's day, and it would most likely be as if it was a gift from God in front of the people to show that the royal power was still strong. And the royal family, like Floria's family, was actually quite the same in its philosophy, which the girls found quite amusing since their family belonged to the demonic school. But the Count warned everyone present that he would not be at the castle soon, as he had to attend a meeting of the Magicians' Society, and so he had left all the household chores to Rikael, and he was to see to everything in the Count's absence. Then turned to Floria and warned her that he would be sure to tell her about the wedding after the meeting, and she thanked her father cheerfully. But after looking around at her brothers, she wondered if she understood why Arden was acting this way. But she didn't understand what had happened to Rikael, as he also looked worried. But the Count calmly remarked that they would need to invite relatives as well, and it would be a good idea to turn the panther into a human as soon as possible. And Floria promised that she would do her best, and after the Count had gone, she informed everyone that she would also like to leave. But Rakiel approached her and informed her that the girl would have to go with him. And then, looking around at her brothers, worried Floria did not understand what had happened to the two of them, for this behavior on Rikael's part was indeed very sudden. But she eventually guessed that maybe it had something to do with the cartel and what had happened between them. But Rikael calmly informed her that he had one assignment that required Floria's intervention, for the daughter of a noble family was in possession of a rare heterogene, and Floria's assignment was to find out who he was. And Floria wasn't even surprised. After all, it wasn't strange in high society that people acquired heterogeneans as pets, but it was strange that her family was interested in it, and it was most likely a very rare species indeed. But she felt strange because Rakiel had called her really late at night to talk about something like that. But at that moment, Rakiel calmly informed her that Floria would be going to their estate in 3 days, since he had already arranged everything. Floria's family was the only one of the followers of the demonic school who were able to reach the rank of earls. After all, most followers of the divine school were dismissive and quietly hated the demonic school, but only their family was treated differently because they produced weapons for war. And the daughter of this family, Floria, was coveted by many aristocrats, but was still a flower that no one could pluck. And the young men courted Floria despite the fact that she belonged to a completely different current. And the young girls envied her beauty, which turned out to be inhuman, and so when Floria found herself in this world, she felt very uncomfortable. Because of all the aristocrats, she had a major hater, Sienna, and she literally hated it when anyone was the center of attention instead of her. And so she was always getting people to somehow shame Floria and pour out the wine, or independently spreading rumors among the guys that Floria was a witch. And she used all sorts of ways to embarrass the girl, but of course it was of no use, for Floria's image was very hard to change. But she was surprised that a girl like that had invited her to tea, because Heterogeneous was probably a very interesting exhibit if Sienna decided to show it off to Floria. But at that moment, due to her endless thoughts, she was approached by Cartel, who asked that the girl fall asleep as soon as possible, and she awkwardly apologized for interrupting him. She thought about the fact that, even though she had asked Rikael to change his mind, it was pointless. And Floria was really scared to leave Cartel in this place, even if it wasn't for long. And earlier she had thought she would feel better when the Count left, but now Rakiel was here, making her even more fearful for her panther's condition. But eventually she got up from her seat and approached Cartel and explained that she needed to get away for a while, so she asked that he behave himself and just wait for her. She looked at the seal that had been placed on Cartel and saw that there was a crack in it, which meant that the seal was reacting to her power. After which she explained that she now wanted to share her power with Cartel and asked that he calm down and turn into a human. But he noted with a smile that it was still early enough for a wedding night. And looking at the madly embarrassed girl, explained that she had earlier told her brother that she was ready to spend a wedding night with him when he became human. But Floria, madly embarrassed by such a remark, touched Cartel's hair and demanded that he should not remember and remind her of such things, and demanded that he change his appearance. But Cartel only calmly noted that no matter how much power the girl poured into him, he still couldn't change anything. Eventually, Floria made a few more attempts, but nothing worked, and so she looked over at Cartel disgruntled, wondering if he hadn't reincarnated on purpose. But he calmly informed her that he himself would like to finally become human. But the next moment the girl began to faint from overexertion, and then coming closer, Cartel caught her and laid her on top of him. And he didn't think much about the fact that his woman didn't know the limit and that she had come into his cage and wasn't frightened, but had fallen asleep on his body. And he didn't understand what she was thinking, because he had to open his mouth just a little, and he could chew her throat with great ease. Then, calmly assuming his own form and looking at Floria asleep in his arms, he thought that it was strange enough that the girl was so innocent. And it seemed as if she were sleeping a very deep sleep because of the fatigue after the sorcery. But with a smile going through her hair in his hands and gently stroking the skin of her face, Cartel admitted that Floria did not bore him at all, and on the contrary, he was even interested. Because even in the first meeting in the basement in the abandoned fortresses, the guy realized that this girl would obviously bring a lot of trouble, because she put him to sleep with her peculiar scent. And when he woke up, he was already in this place. And it was also very strange to him that the seal that had held him back all his life was suddenly reacting to Floria, and a crack appeared. And at this point, he could safely break that seal and escape as originally planned to do. But to Cartel's surprise, it was as if a flower as bold as Floria had asked to be destroyed by him. So he gently rolled the girl over onto her stomach and began undoing one by one the buttons of her nightdress, until he saw Floria's completely bare back, and he noticed that there was no pattern on her back that should have appeared after the technique was applied. But there was no same blessing on her body, and so he didn't understand how on earth this girl had been able to recognize his name, and why his seal only reacted to this flower. But after carefully tucking it back in, Cartel reflected that he had previously thought Floria was just a cheeky flower, but it turned out to be quite different. And so Cartel wondered with a smile how such a girl could dare to marry a beast. And kissing her to a strand of her hair, pondered that marrying him was the same as turning herself into living fodder voluntarily. Well, the next moment Cartel turned around, for he heard footsteps and stated that the one he expected to see that night had already come. Ended up the next day with a maddeningly disgruntled Floria, pondering that it had been very reckless indeed to fall asleep in a cage locked with Cartel. But I noticed that it was the first time I'd ever seen him asleep, and so when I woke up, I couldn't believe that such a large and intimidating beast could be so cute when asleep. But then Floria remembered that no matter how many powers she used on Cartel, he could never turn into a human, and thought that maybe he was the problem. At this moment, she was approached by an excited maid who inquired if anything was troubling Floria. But the girl only calmly remarked that she did not allow the maid to speak to her first, for if there had been any inconvenience, she would have warned her about it long ago. And looking at the awkward maid, she thought that she would hate to do that to such a kind person, but she was worried that something might happen to her. She can't pay more attention to someone than she should, because the butler will notice and she'll be replaced by another maid. And replacing that maid will mean her premature death. But it didn't take long before they finally arrived at the Count's castle, and so it was time to deal with the business on which Floria had arrived. For now it was important to fulfill Rikael's order, and so she found herself in a glass hothouse, which was known to the whole of society, for in this place various foreign flowers were collected, that you'd only ever seen in textbooks before, and it was a really beautiful place. But in the end, it didn't take long before she noticed the assembled ladies who had summoned Florius to the table. and Sienna calmly stated that Floria had made her very glad of her arrival. But the girl was not confused, and confessed that she was very much flattered by Lady Sienna's invitation, for it was a great honor to look at her beautiful greenhouse. But Lady Sienna calmly remarked that her greenhouse was so beautiful only because of the enormous amount of effort that had been put into it. But afterward, a heterogeneous maid came up, and Sienna wondered what the girls thought of her. Sienna boasted that the maid obeyed her perfectly, but Floria immediately remembered that the cat genes gave a high level of pride and did not understand why Lily so calmly obeyed all orders, but noticed that she was wearing a necklace with a stone that controlled her mind. But on a heterogeneous high rank such as Cartel, such a thing would not work. However, stones could be used to control those creatures with lower levels. And so Floria inquired of Lady Sienna how she had been able to tame this creature. For this stone was forbidden to be used even on common slaves because it destroys the mind of the one who wears it. But Sienna awkwardly reported that originally Lily had been too willful, and so she had done everything she could to be safe. And Floria felt very sorry for the girl, for she was literally being looked at like a monkey in an enclosure. But Lady Sienna calmly informed that she had other pets as well, and asked Floria if she was good at heterogeneous, since her family belonged to the demonic school. But she calmly informed that she had often had to observe such creatures. And then all the girls around wondered that Floria's family was incredible, for they could keep many heterogeneous in the castle, and they would like to come to Floria's house for a tea party. But at this point, offended by such attention to Floria, Sienna confessed that she had a personal request for Floria, because of which she had invited her to the tea party. Then asked the other assembled ladies to keep what she had told her a secret, and then Floria guessed that Sienna obviously wanted the rumors to spread throughout the social circle. After that, she asked all the ladies to follow her, and Floria realized that if even Sienna didn't call the maids, then there was something really interesting there. But then Sienna herself admitted that she actually had a very special heterogeneous from a rare breed, and so there was a lot of trouble from it. And Floria smelled salt, as if they were on the seashore, and the next moment she saw a gleam of water, after which a merman came out of the water. This guy's scales shimmered under the blue waves, and his sparkling smile flared under the splashing water. And Russell had emerald eyes like beads. And then Sienna said that she had to spend a lot of energy and savings to get this Russell. At that moment, Floria heard someone's voice, and when she turned her attention to Russell, he informed her that his name was not Orca, but Acylid, and he was a sea merman. And while Sienna and the rest of the girls were busy talking, they were completely oblivious to the similar dialogue that took place between Floria and the mermaid. And then Wall reported that normally Orca didn't like to show his face in public, so something really weird happened today. In fact, this girl's family ran their country's diplomatic relations, and so there was an endless stream of bribes in that family, and Mermaid was most likely one of them. And then, putting together everything that Sienna had said, Floria realized that this Russell had been given to her father by a merchant, and then Floria guessed that it was most likely someone connected to a recent shipwreck on the Atlantic Ocean. And these people had been rescued by Sienna's family, so it was not surprising that they had given her such a gift, which was truly amazing. And though Floria knew about the bribes, she hadn't expected it to be a mermaid. In fact, all mermaids were under the patronage of the sea, and it was no secret that many armed warships sank because of whirlpools, which made mermaids, and thanks to this, mermaids could avoid the fate of other heterogeneous, and did not fall into the hands of humans. At which point the guy turned to her and asked that Floria not pretend not to hear him at all. And then the lad confessed that he didn't like his name at all, for every mermaid had a name given to him at birth. But at that moment, Sienna turned to her and asked Floria if she had ever seen mermaids, but it was obvious that the girl was just scoffing. After all, she thought she was better because of the fact that there were no such creatures in Floria's castles. But afterward, she admitted that she actually had a bit of a question, because as it turned out, mermaids didn't eat fish at all. And then the madly surprised girl wondered if Sienna had really gotten the idea to feed Russell fish, but still agreed to help her. And taking advantage of the situation, approached the mermaid, and looking at him stated that he was wounded, because of which his fin was torn, and he was very pale and thin. But the mermaid said that people did not hurt him, because when he woke up, he was already here. And then Floria thought that perhaps the merchant had caught the wounded Rusal on purpose and given him to Sienna. And the worried Sienna confessed that the boy was wounded, but he hadn't eaten anything, so he kept getting thinner and thinner. And disgruntled Floria did not understand how it was possible to bring a creature into her house without even knowing how to treat and feed it, but calmly said that mermaids do not eat fish. Then approached one of the noblewomen and complimented her pearl earrings and asked if she could take them. Then she, approaching the mermaid, gave him a pearl, and he mentally thanked the girl for such tasty treats. And Floria, turning to Sienna, calmly explained that mermaids feed on pearls, and that's why the guy lost so much weight, because she tried to feed him fish. At that moment, a cat appeared out of nowhere and jumped at Floria, pushing her into the water with its paws, and she lost her balance and began to fall into the pool. But before she fell, Floria clearly noticed Sienna's face and realized the reason why this girl had led her to the pool. But something strange happened, because the girl was pushed back as if by magic to prevent her from falling into the water. And then the aristocrats around her thought about how nice it was that the mermaid had saved Floria, and she only stated with a smile that she seemed to like the creature a lot, even though she knew he hadn't done anything. Then, passing by Sienna, she noted that she had helped her enough and reflected that she had never used the flower girl's gifts on ordinary people before. But it seemed to her that one little whim could hardly do her any harm. Floria eventually left to the sound of worried aristocrats who didn't understand what had happened to Lady Sienna. But once in the carriage, Floria still didn't understand who had created the dark fire that had helped her keep her balance. But at that moment she remembered that in the book, only one person ran it, and that was the cartel. But that literally couldn't be it. In the end, she returned home, and there was Rikael waiting for her, who was expecting Flory to report back. And she calmly explained that the merchants were involved in the affair, who had paid off the count by giving his daughter the wounded Rusal. But she warned that it would be hard enough to move him, since mermaids can't stay out of the water for long, especially since they didn't have a large enough source yet. In fact, right now, Floria's younger brother Valus was at the border of the country to be in contact with the slave merchants who were pursuing the heterogeneous, for Valus was in charge of transporting the heterogeneous and rare monsters to the castle. But of course that wasn't the only duty, but Floria knew that her little brother should be back soon. But at that moment, Rakiel calmly stated that even if he was a little late, nothing would happen to the mermaid. So, as soon as Valus returned, they were to go together to take the mermaids back to their home. After which he seemed to want to add something else, but calmly exhaled and said that Floria could already leave. Eventually, Floria started down to Cartel, but when she looked around, he wasn't moving, and so the girl wondered if he might be asleep. But the next moment, she realized that he had always woken up earlier, and so, remembering Rakiel's intention, she thought he might have done something to Cartel while she was away, and so burst in with shaking hands and began to stroke his fur, begging Cartel to wake up. But he opened his eyes quietly, and then looking around him, Floria wondered if he was in pain, but he admitted that he was indeed in unbearable pain. Then he assumed his human form, towering over Floria, stated that his heart ached, for the girl had left him in such a body, and for so long he had tasted alone. But a shocked Floria looked back at Cartel and remembered that he had previously claimed he couldn't reincarnate and wondered how that had happened. But he looked over Floria calmly, and running his hands along her tender neck, admitted that it was Floria who must know whether he could reincarnate or not, for he could not do it at will. After which Cartel admitted that Floria was actually insanely beautiful, and she turned her head away in embarrassment, asking that the guy not say something like that to her. But at this moment, he took her hand in his and bit Floria's finger, after which he began to lick the wound gently, and asked that the girl should not come to him again with the odor of another man, for he was disgusted. But she was only embarrassed, snatching her hand back grudgingly, and demanded that Cartel not behave like that, for he was not a dog, and demanded that he put on his clothes. But Cartel calmly said that although he was not a dog, he had a good sense of smell and could smell the sea fish coming from the girl. And then an embarrassed Floria confessed that she had gone to sort out some family business, and there briefly met a mermaid. But afterward, she thought about the fact that Cartel had no control over her reincarnation, and there was difficulty in that, for such heterogeneity of reincarnations indicated that the flow of her magic did not match the seal. And she didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, so she had two assumptions. Either the seal's magic would eventually weaken on its own, or the seal itself was feeding off her magic and taking it away. And Floria realized that it would be much easier if the seal were electric, for then she could easily break it. But she asked the boy to join her in trying to figure out a way to get rid of the seal before her father came back. But the next moment she saw that the guy, instead of putting on the cape, had just wrapped it around his waist, and so a disgruntled Floria yelled at Cartel, explaining that he shouldn't have done that. After which she herself awkwardly realized that she was acting as if she were telling off an animal. But Cartel only remarked with a smile that if Floria was going to train him, she should have been given a reward. For as she asked, he waited quietly and calmly for her and wore so unpleasant a piece of cloth. And then Floria confessed that Cartel was really very docile, so much so that she at first thought he was dead, but didn't realize what reward the boy wanted from her. And so all she could think of was to touch his hair, and stroking it, Floria realized that the sensation was really different, for Cartel's hair was very soft and silky. But the embarrassed boy wondered, was this really all his reward? And then the disgruntled girl, turning around and getting ready to leave, promised that she would make sure that no one else came to the boy's house and did not disturb him. And she hoped that he would be able to reincarnate again before morning. But in the end, just before she left, Cartel only smilingly stated that he thought his reward was somehow too small, and warned that she, Floria, would continue to underestimate him. He might just swallow her, and reflected that there wasn't much time left before he could throw off his shackles. And then all the magic that came in and out thanks to the seal would gather in him, and previously the seal had closed off any access to his magic. But with the appearance of Floria's magic, everything was completely different, for her magic was no longer locked up in the seal, but rather gathered in it, and in addition to being able to reincarnate into a person thanks to Floria, his own magic began to return to him. But for now, he was weak, and it was only enough to be around someone, and thought about the fact that he had indeed fulfilled all of Floria's requests, but he didn't understand where he had gotten such an incomprehensible dissatisfaction with Floria, as if he wanted this girl to become more in his life. For this satisfaction was not something secret and utterly unfamiliar to him, and it was not like that helplessness when he could not go on fighting. To him, Floria was a beautiful flower that brought light into his life while pretending to be very bright. But there were too many annoying bugs around her. And most unpleasant of all, that night while Floria slept in Cartel's arms, a falcon with silver wings came to him. And then when she saw Floria, she didn't hesitate to bare her sword demanding that Cartel back off and not touch his sister. He admitted that he had been careless in thinking that Cartel was just a beast, but he didn't know what kind of animal he was. But the boy ignored his words and asked Raquiel to keep his voice down, for he might wake his flower. And then Miguel realized that he was very much mistaken when he thought that the boys were brought here only for experiments, because he himself had assisted in taking such a monster from the palace and had even left the alicorn to the king. And in return he got a key that opened a sealed room, and his assignment wasn't to transport the cartel, so he couldn't see it. But he knew one thing, that there was a monster in that cave, but he didn't focus on that, because he was helping the alicorn adapt to the capital little by little. And then Pi flew in with a letter from the order, and Raquel was really shocked when he read it. So he demanded that Cartel explain how his sister could ever agree to marry such trash who'd been kicked out of the palace. But Cartel, calmly kissing the locks of Floria's hair, confessed that he knew nothing, for this flower had come to him on her own and asked him for a favor. But then Raquel couldn't stand such insolence and activated his magic, which was directed at Cartel, but Cartel only calmly stated that apparently Sparrow had decided to piss him off, and calmly managed to repel his attack by activating his fire. And then, looking at this picture, Raquel immediately realized that the cartel's fire was as if protecting what was behind the bars, and realized that the dark flame that was moving as if alive and threatening the opponent in front of him was nothing but the magical power of the monster. and it was clearly different from the one possessed by the royal family. And then Rakiel remembered that the king himself had told him that Cartel possessed no magic, no consciousness, and no skills in controlling the elements. And even though Cartel was royalty, even his father treated him like he wasn't his own, so he sold him for experiments. But the reality turned out to be quite different. And so Rakiel realized that before this monster was released from its shackles, he simply had to kill it. But Cartel calmly stated that Rakiel would not help his sister in any way by his actions, for a flower like her makes her own way. But despite the shock of Cartel's words, Rakiel forced himself to pull himself together, realizing that he had to destroy his enemy, or he wouldn't be able to do it afterwards. But looking at his sister, he realized sadly that he had apparently failed to protect so young and innocent Floria, and so she had to defend herself. And so Rakiel quietly inquired about their contract, but Cartel calmly remarked that there was a contract between them, for they would both benefit from it. And that's when Rakiel realized that he should back off, for he was willing to sacrifice a lot for his little sister. Eventually, wandering the corridors of her palace, Floria reflected on how long it had been since she had returned from Siena, but she still hadn't heard any news from Risael. And perhaps he wanted to wait for Velis, her brother, to return, and Floria wondered which of them would return first, her father or her brother. But in any case, both of them made Floria worry, for her father would want to check on the Cartel, and Velis would want to go after Rusel, so she would have to leave home. But Cartel's reincarnation was unstable, and the seal was still absorbing Floria's magic well, and she didn't understand what the instability was related to. And also, Floria was worried that the guy reincarnated at the most unexpected moment. And also, Floria would like Cartel to remain in any clothes when reincarnating, and she did not have to see his naked body every time and burn with shame. But at that moment, she heard a voice as light and soft as the wind and maddeningly familiar. But it had been a long time since Floria had been able to hear Arden's voice lately. And then the guy smiled haggardly and admitted that he would really like to talk to Floria, and from his face, the girl immediately realized that apparently he was still worried about her wedding and looked as if he had weakened a lot. Floria thought of offering Arden a little walk in the garden, but as it turned out, the butler had already given him the task. The butler was the Count's confidant, and therefore often gave them different tasks, and Arden was always in charge of tracking traitors, for he had the gift of hearing the voices of trees, and by asking any tree he could find out everything it heard and saw. And it could be anything, secrets of other people's families, or information where someone was setting up a cover-up with Heterogeneous to get their hands on it. And such traitors were eventually caught and kept in the basement of the tower behind bars. But if they got there, it would have been better to die than to endure this abuse. And Floria knew very well that to Arden's mild temperament, such a task was torture, and the only reason for his obedience was Floria's. But Arden calmly walked over and took his sister's hand, lifting her gaze to his face, and asked her not to do anything that might get her hurt, and confessed that it was very hard for him not to understand Florius's behavior, and promised that he would do all the tasks for her so that she could live in peace and be happy. And then looking back at her brother, Floria noticed that his hands were still trembling, for he was more afraid of killing than anything else in the world. And so, in an attempt to calm her down, she stopped the boy and reminded him that Arden would always be her brother to her, no matter what she did, no matter where she was. And that phrase, spoken in a place where lies reigned, was truly sincere. And so, when her brother accepted her words, Floria asked that Arden should believe her and just wait. Eventually, Floria went to the flower garden she had previously wanted to go to, but still continued to worry about Arden, for it was hard for him to run such errands. But at that moment, the girl's younger brother came in, who didn't understand where Floria had gone and was screaming and looking for her. But afterwards he remembered that he had forgotten to warn about something, so he turned to the Heterogeneous and explained to the maid that everything related to the Heterogeneous he would put under the responsibility of the servants, as he was very much fed up with it. But when those began to scold the lad for his behavior, which was disgraceful for members of the same species, he only glanced back and made him scream with horror. then took his true form, and then his fingers became much longer, and his nails turned into claws that were ready to tear someone's throat in seconds. But when he heard his sister's footsteps, he immediately returned to his usual form, and running up to her threw himself into Floria's arms, for he missed her very much indeed, and she congratulated him on his return. But before she left, she looked over the prisoners she had brought in and noticed the fact that they were wearing tattered clothing and their entire bodies were strewn with equals, and she saw their rage-filled gaze. But noticing Floria's so much attention to the captives, Velis suggested that they leave as soon as possible and get some rest. And in the end, they did so. But later, the younger brother confessed to his sister that although he wanted to wash, he was very uncomfortable because he did not want to part with Floria. And she, stroking his hair, asked him to wash as soon as possible and return to her, and she promised to help him dry his hair, then left alone. Floria admitted that sending her little brother to the bathroom had not been easy, and she had obviously relaxed and hadn't expected him to be back so early. And remember, the boy in the book, Velis, had the appearance of a sweet child, but his character was insanely cruel, so he could easily have killed Floria. And as a result of the experiments, which were carried out on the boy, his physical strength was much higher than that of his other relatives, so there were many victims who were deceived by his pretty face and lost their lives for it. But luckily for Floria, her brother treated her very well, and it's a child who really trusts her words and takes them too literally. And she remembered sitting with her brother one day and seeing a beautiful butterfly. And it wasn't even a day before my brother caught and brought in thousands of butterflies. But that was just the beginning. Also, there was a situation when a guy slit the throat of one of the maids because of her mistake, and Floria was still scared to remember the bloody face of his brother, who asked him to praise him. Of course, they had already agreed that the boy wouldn't do it again, but still, it was not without consequences. But at that moment, Velis came back and announced happily that he wanted his sister to dry his hair, after which Floria remarked that they would also need to meet the rest of the family afterward. But Velis snuggled up to Floria and admitted that he would only have the company of his sister. Then confessed that because he had come back from afar, he was very tired. So he asked Floria to sleep with him one night, and then looking into his pleading face, the girl could not refuse, because she knew she couldn't leave that baby. So she would just have to go along with his entreaties. In the end, at night, Velis, hugging his sister joyfully, confessed that he had been very good to her. And Floria reflected that if her brother always looked and behaved the same way, he would be like a real angel. But he belonged to the race of wolves, who were sexless, and when they came of age, they split into male and female, acquiring an adult body. But now Velis was not of either gender, and from birth the boy's appearance was like a doll's, and so he was recorded as a girl in the family registry. At that moment, Floria remembered and warned Velis that they would have another errand this week, and this time they would go together, but she didn't know the details yet. But at that moment, a maddeningly disgruntled fellow rose and announced that in that case, he would go in order to inquire about everything now. But when Floria tried to stop him, Velis remarked that he was the one who should be doing the dangerous business, not Floria. But she said that the case wasn't that dangerous, so they would go together, especially since Velis could protect her the whole time, so she would definitely be fine. And then the joyful child promised Floria that he would protect her so that nothing would happen to her. And then she calmly put him back to bed. But eventually the boy promised that when he grew up, they would definitely get married and explained that he didn't care, that it was not allowed to have a marriage within the family, which made Floria very uncomfortable, because Velis had been talking about something like this since he was 5 years old. And now he's older, but nothing's changed. Also, Floria was very anxious about the possibility of her brother finding out about her marriage, so she decided to keep it a secret. Eventually, the next day came, and the girl decided to go to the cartel. But in the end, her brother wanted to go with him, and Floria expected something like this, for Velis had always been inseparable from her. The girl also realized that she couldn't leave her brother alone because he might get angry and kill everyone, so she tried to explain as calmly as possible that she needed to leave for a while in order to deal with the monster that was in the basement. And eventually, she succeeded in convincing the boy, at least she thought so. But as soon as she was gone, he took on his true form and wondered what his sister was really hiding from him. And so, as soon as he saw Rikael, he demanded some kind of explanation about what was hiding in the cellar. But Rakiel advised Velus to just mind his own business. And then the disgruntled lad promised that as soon as he reached adulthood, he would surely destroy everyone, and as for Rakiel specifically. But he didn't seem at all surprised by such threats. But when Floria went down to the basement, the first thing she saw was a dressed cartel, which she was surprised to see. But he calmly stated that Floria's training had indeed been effective. But she only grudgingly reflected that she couldn't do otherwise when the guy was constantly walking around naked in front of her. And so she just quietly praised him. But he approached the girl without a drop of shame or embarrassment and demanded that she reward him for his efforts, and she awkwardly realized that apparently Cartel thought it was her duty to reward him. But in the end, she stroked his head and wondered if that might be enough. But it seemed quite different to Cartel, and so he intercepted the girl's hands and began to pull her closer to his body, explaining that stroking him was not a reward, but one of Florius's obligations. Whereupon he bent over, Floria explained that the reward he desired could wait a little while. And maddeningly embarrassed by their proximity, Floria pushed him away. After that, she scolded the guy, not understanding why this cartel allows himself something like this, because she knew that according to the story, he should be with a completely different girl, namely with the main character. And of course she wanted to tell him something like that, but she couldn't do it, because most likely even now the guy was just playing with her. She wanted to tell him something like that, but she couldn't, because even now the guy was probably just playing with her. If he had lived in a human body, he would have been able to afford anything. But unfortunately, Cartel was originally born in the form of a beast, because the royal family didn't want to accept him, because they were afraid of losing their reputation, so they locked Cartel up and thus stole his opportunity for a normal life. But Cartel calmly explained that his regrets wouldn't change anything, especially since he remembered the days when he was still in his mother's womb, because he could feel everything his mother felt, saw, or heard. And at that moment, Floria realized how on earth the fellow could know about the florists, and also about her family, for she had not previously understood how he had got this information. But at that moment, Cartel admitted that he wished he could tear out the throat of the man who had accused his mother, for she was quite innocent. But Floria calmly explained that he could do as he saw fit when he got out of this place, especially since it knew that in the original story, the royal family would collapse and a new age would come. And if Cartel could meet the main character, all of that would be possible, and then Floria would be free to live her life, even if she had to give up the cartel and disappear from the guy's life forever. And then she said goodbye and quietly said she had to leave. But on the night of the same day, she received a message from her father, who was still absent, so he contacted similarly through a letter. But Floria was glad, because she knew that the Count should not know about Cartel's condition yet, which meant only one thing, that she could wait and not tell Velus about her wedding yet. Ended up in the carriage, Floria realized she was worrying so much because she had always been an information gatherer and had never been involved in heterogeneous transports. When they arrived at Sienna's estate, they found that there were guards, as befits a powerful aristocratic family, and it was personal to wait for the time to change guards. But Velus calmly informed her that he would go first and clear the way for Floria to follow. For in fact, Velus not only possessed insane physical strength and agility, for in his veins flowed the blood of black wolves, and so he had the ability to control shadows and darkness. So the boy was perfect for such tasks, as he could hide his presence, and with the help of his abilities during the changing of the guards, they were able to sneak inside the manor. But when they entered, they immediately noticed that Lily was there, standing in the middle of the greenhouse in a black, gloomy silhouette, waiting for her mistress's orders. And an agitated Velus ordered his sister to stay away, but she calmly explained that this girl was not dangerous. And looking over her clothes, Lily realized that they were dirty, and most likely Sienna had just thrown this girl away. And so Floria approached her and took off the collar that suppressed her will, for she wanted to give her freedom, and did not understand how Sienna had allowed herself not even to remove the relationship that had so tormented the girl's mind. and pondered the fact that it would be hard enough to restore Lily's former intelligence, but thought about the fact that the heterogeneous from the cat tribe could become cats. And so she applied her gift of sense, which made Lily a cat again, and then she, stroking the kitten, explained that the girl could go wherever she wanted, and thought that she hoped the girl could live out the rest of her life on the outside, even in this guise. But looking back at her brother, she immediately noticed that Valus seemed to be offended, so she stroked her brother's head and explained that Valus obviously shouldn't have been jealous of that cat, and suggested we go to the pool. And then the merman woke up and wondered if someone had come again just to look at him. But when he surfaced, he saw that it was Floria, and he was really happy to see her. But Floria looked at Russell and noticed that he seemed to have stopped starving. But the boy admitted that what Floria had fed him was really the most delicious. And she noticed the look on her earring and admitted she brought it in case the guy was hungry. But at that moment, their conversation was noticed by a madly disgruntled boy who did not understand why Floria was paying such attention to some fish, and the girl tried to calm him down because Valus had already fantasized too much. And then Floria, in order to comfort her brother, promised that they would now complete the task as quickly as possible, after which they would return home and sleep together. And the Russell only calmly stated, to all appearances, that this boy was a wolf boy. But Floria was interested in another thing, for she looked at his fin wounds and wondered if there was any way of curing them. As it turned out, there was only one way. It was to return him to the sea, but he did not know if it was possible, because he understood what the girl's family was doing. Because Sienna, who considered herself mistress of the mermaid, every day talked about something like this, and said that they needed him for experience, and asked the girl if it was true. And she was shocked by such a question and did not even know how to answer it, because the guy understood perfectly well why they came for him and knew what they would do with him. Floria had a lot of questions she wanted to ask Russell, but in the end she couldn't do it because of the tears that were coming closer and closer and stuck in her throat. And now she couldn't ask Russell anything, because she realized that her tears would look like an act and nothing more. But the next moment, the younger brother came over and informed his sister that everything was ready and activated the runes. It was a special spell using magical stones, and as soon as it was activated, the guy immediately rose into the air, shrouded in water, and the Russell was very surprised that people had learned to use such things. But Floria calmly explained that the road would not cause him any suffering, because the stones would keep his body moist. And then the mermaid, looking around, noticed that he had legs, and Floria said that apparently mermaids grew legs when they were out of the water. After which they left the hothouse and got into the carriage, and the brother stated that they must hurry, for he wished to play with his sister as soon as possible, and so they had to return to the manor. And Floria awkwardly requested that her brother should take his time and drive the carriage carefully. That's how they ended up going. And then, sitting in the same carriage across from Asilid, Floria wondered if this guy hadn't resisted at all and had quietly let himself be picked up, and she wouldn't be able to protect him when they got home. Because unlike Cartel, this guy would definitely be used for experiments, and she knew he'd hate her for that, because at least he hadn't been bullied at his old place. But at that moment, suddenly the guy asked that the girl hug him instead of being sad, because she shouldn't have been so sad, and blamed herself for everything that had happened, because he couldn't have lived long anyway. And then, looking at Floria's shocked face, he explained that when mermaids moved away from the sea, they lost their life force. And besides, he was injured, so no matter how those people tried, they couldn't recreate the sea environment in the pond, and he couldn't survive in that place. And then Floria wondered if that was the reason why the lad had agreed to go with them so easily, but he confessed that what he really wanted was to look at Floria a little more, after which he embraced the girl and asked if she could take him with her, and then the excited Floria wondered if the lad really wanted her to hide him. But he could not live long on land anyway, and the sea was too far away. But she didn't want to lead him to the castle herself, but at that moment, the guy gently touching Floria's face asked her not to panic, because everything would be fine as long as they were near each other. And then, filled with sick determination, Floria wondered what she should do, and Asilid suggested a way out of the situation, namely to make a contract. And then she realized that most likely Asilid already knew about her one contract, and so she wondered if she could do something like that, but still agreed. And then the guy moved closer to her ear, and the pearl that was food for Rusal started to glow. And then the madly surprised girl didn't understand what was going on. And the guy carefully whispered to the embarrassed Floria in her ear that mermaids were children of the sea god, and the tears of this sea god were pearls. That's why mermaids could see the past and the future. And so everything that Floria wanted to do will definitely come true, and she only had to wait. Whereupon he, slowly passing into the pearl in Florius's earring, asked that the beautiful flower accomplish all her purposes. And by this time, the carriage was just about to reach the house. And then Floria was in for a serious talk, for when the carriage was opened, Rusal was not there, and Floria could not tell that he lurked in her earring. No one would believe such a thing. And so the brother, realizing the gravity of the situation, took the whole responsibility and said that he had driven the carriage carelessly and had probably dropped Rusal into the river when it turned sharply. But Floria didn't let him take her on and calmly informed him that she would write her father an explanation herself and asked that her name be written. And Floria was well aware that she would be punished for the loss of so rare a species. But it was far better than condemning Asilid to a life in hell. But to her surprise, the older brother said that their father did not know about the situation with the mermaid at all, and Floria and the younger brother had been on the expedition since yesterday. And then Floria realized that apparently her brother wanted to close the case without her father's knowledge. Eventually, when they came out, the agitated boy questioned Floria about what had happened and didn't understand why she couldn't confide even to him. But she calmly explained that she also didn't know all where the situation had become. But she admitted that the mermaid had disappeared before her eyes. After which, she suggested that he go to his room and sleep, and then walking down the corridors. Floria thought that everything that was happening to her was very strange, because Asilid hid in the pearl, and her older brother sent them on a mission without her father's orders.